Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 319 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. Love him or hate him, it's hard to take one step into the medieval world without running into the larger-than-life figure of Richard the Lionheart. Rebel, crusader, prisoner, castle builder, Richard is one of the most colorful and quotable kings of the Middle Ages, an image he cultivated to increase his own public profile. So, how did medieval people see him? This week, I spoke with Dr. Heather Blurton about the life and legacy of Richard I. Heather is a professor of English at UC Santa Barbara and the author, co-author, and editor of several books, including Cannibalism in High Medieval English Literature and Inventing William of Norwich, Thomas of Monmouth, Anti-Semitism and Literary Culture, 1150 to 1200. Her new book is Richard the Lionheart in Life and Legend. Our conversation on how Richard's contemporaries saw him, the wild stories told about him in the later Middle Ages, and why we still just can't get enough of this controversial king is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Heather, to talk about Richard the Lionheart. This is exciting. I'm happy to talk about him, and I don't think I've done a whole episode on Richard before, so this is great. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's nice to have a new book about Richard because he's always appearing, and it's nice to have people sort of like catch up to where we are in our current cultural moment and where Richard is. And you have a really great quote in the book about Richard and innovation, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But first, let's figure out who this guy is, because sometimes people are like, which one is this? I think a lot of people know about Richard the Lionheart, but he's Richard the First, born into one of the most chaotic families in the Middle Ages.
That's right.
Tell us all about it.
Well, I mean, I think kind of the most interesting thing about Richard the Lionheart is that he's a household name at all for us, because there just aren't that many 12th century kings who are well known, in the 21st century. So part of what's interesting about Richard is how he manages to get and keep that reputation. But yeah, as you say, he was born into this extraordinary family. His father was Henry II of England, and his mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And, he was never really meant to be king. He had two older brothers, one of whom died in childhood, but the other, Henry, the so-called young king, to distinguish himself from his father, Henry II. I mean, the young King Henry was quite a famous figure in his own right, well known for being a great warrior, for being very courteous. But unfortunately, he caught a fever and died in early adulthood. And so Richard ended up sort of against the odds as his father's presumptive heir.
Yes, which would have been, as you say, a surprise to everybody, not least of all Richard, who was not really planning to be king of England proper. And this is going to become really important to his story and how he's remembered. But his dad divided up the kingdom while he was still alive. And the part of the kingdom that Richard got was really influential on him. So what part of the kingdom did Richard get as his sort of like patrimony?
Well, Henry II had an unusual problem in the Middle Ages in that he had too many sons, really. So, I mean, you want to have just enough sons to have an heir, but not too many sons that they're going to be quarrelsome amongst themselves. And of course, Henry's sons were. But it looked as if what Henry II was going to do is give the Kingdom of England to his eldest son, the young Prince Henry, and then Richard would have inherited his mother's lands, which was the Duchy of Aquitaine in the south of France. And he seems, throughout his life to have been perhaps most attached to those lands and to have thought of himself, primarily as Aquitanian, maybe, rather than English in the way we now think of him.
Yeah, and I think from what you said in the book, he gets this patrimony when he's 15 years old. So this is still a time when he is really apt to be influenced. And this is something that I think really ties him to his mother. So tell us a little bit about Richard and his mom. They had kind of a special relationship, don't you think?
They did. I mean, Eleanor is such a marvelous figure in her own right, but she seems very much to have, wanted her lands to pass to one of her sons intact rather than to be subsumed within the larger English kingdom or Angevin Empire. And so she really, had taken Richard under her wing, and they worked very closely together. And then ultimately, she took the sides of Richard and her other sons when they finally rebelled against their father, Henry II. And it didn't end well. So the boys were ultimately reconciled with their father, but Eleanor ended up basically under house arrest for the rest of Henry II's long reign. And basically Richard's first act upon inheriting the kingdom was to let his mother out of prison. So yeah, and then she, seems to have served as a kind of regent for him. He was on Crusade. She was an extraordinarily, sort of powerful and agile woman up into her 80s. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And one of the things that I think is really kind of touching is on Richard's deathbed, which we'll get to in a second, he does call for his mother and she shows up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So Richard finally inherits the kingdom, wasn't expecting it. What is the first thing he does is let his mom out, but then he immediately wants to leave his kingdom, right? Tell us about Richard wanting to leave England.
Well, I mean, what had happened was, that's probably one of the most consequential events in Western medieval history, which is in 1171. The Christian kingdom in Jerusalem, which had been captured during the First Crusade, fell to the forces of Saladin. And this just, sent shockwaves throughout Western Europe. And Richard, among many other people, immediately took the cross and declared that he was ready to go on crusade. But sort of political events at home overtook him, particularly the struggles between him and his brother and his father. And so it wasn't until he was able to inherit the kingdom, have his coronation, put out a nice tax so he could afford to go on crusade. But then, yeah, really his first act as king was to take off for Palestine to try to recapture Jerusalem, along with many of the other rulers of England, so Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip Augustus of France. Everyone was going.
Yeah, the whole team. I do want to pause on Richard's coronation for a second, because one of the things that you remind us in your book is that this was actually a really terrible moment for some of the people in the kingdom, in that the coronation of Richard the First was a celebration for many people, but it was a horrible time for the Jewish population. So let's take a moment to dig into this, because I think this gets lost in Richard's story very often.
It's a little bit unclear what happened, but Richard seems to have barred both women and Jews from his coronation festivities in London. And it's not clear if this was traditional or an innovation. Historians argue over that, but in the event, a Jewish delegation from London decided to come and present Richard with presents to celebrate his coronation, but the violence sparked off. There was some pushing and shoving, people who didn't think that the Jewish delegation ought to be there, and it sparked off this pogrom in London where a large proportion of the Jewish neighborhood and town was attacked, was set on fire. People were killed. And then this attack in London sparked attacks up and down England. So it was obviously sort of a disastrous moment in a lot of ways, but it was really emblematic of crusading culture in its larger context, where, you had some people who were saying, well, why are we going all the way to Palestine to fight non-Christians when we have people we need to deal with here at home? So it was very emblematic of the crusading culture of the time.
Yeah, for sure. And just sort of close out that chapter, Richard did reestablish the fact that the Jewish population is under the protection of the king. So he does settle that down, and he does toe the traditional line, which is that the Jewish population is under the protection of the king. And this is something that does continue, but it is an important moment, I think, that does get forgotten. So this settles at home. And I'm not sure how much time he spends caring about whether this settles at home, but it does. And then he sets off on crusade.
No king wants an outbreak of violence, right? Basically, if you're a king, you want everything to be calm and under your control. So,
yeah. So one of the people that he goes off on crusade with is Philip Augustus, who he's known for a really long time. This is the French king. And they go off together. And at this point, their relationship is not the best it's ever been, but this relationship is also central to Richard's story, especially I think in the last 100 years, people talking about these two figures. So what's your take on this, the French king and Richard the Lionheart?
Well, I mean, the controversy is to what extent their friendship was just a friendship or whether it was a little bit more, right? And the big quote is this 12th century chronicler, Roger of Howden, writes that Philip of France and Richard were so close that, quote, every day they ate at the same table and from the same dish, and at night had not separate chambers, end quote. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really until the 1950s that historians started to suggest that this meant that Richard and Philip's relationship may have been sexual as well as political. But then a lot of other historians will say actually the evidence doesn't really support that, you know, men in the Middle Ages had different ways of showing emotions, emotional attachments to one another. And in fact, there's this other sort of interesting story about Philip's closeness with Richard's brother, Geoffrey, such that when Geoffrey died, there's this story of Philip having to be physically restrained from throwing himself in the grave on top of Geoffrey's dead body. So, you know, in a lot of ways, we were dealing with a very different public affective culture than we have now. But certainly this representation of Richard as potentially enjoying the company of men has gone through contemporary literature, and you see it in movies like A Lion in Winter, novels like Jean Plady's A Heart of the Lion, which is a sort of famous take from the 1970s. So it's kind of come into our cultural discourse about Richard in a way that it certainly, I think, was not in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it wasn't unusual for men to share a cup or a dish or even a bed. This is just a kind of a normal thing. And I think that the quote that you're talking about is just meant to suggest closeness. But then again, we don't want to make the mistake of being like, these people are just roommates when they're obviously not roommates, you know. So it's important to look at these things. But I think you're right. I'm not sure that this particular quote, for example, proves anything in any direction. But I think that there's always going to be a question mark over that, at least since people have been talking about this since the 50s. But Richard is also, he was accused by his contemporaries of being kind of lusty in general, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And we know that he did have at least one illegitimate son whom he recognized and financed. So, and of course, he was ultimately, you know, married in a political marriage to Berengaria of Navarre. So, the scene is very complicated. And I think that certainly when we look at the medieval chroniclers who are talking about the closeness between Richard and Philip, they're concerned about the political implications of that affective closeness as much as the moral or sexual implications of it.
Yeah. If he's really tight with the French king, what does this mean for our lands on the continent? Exactly. So Richard goes off on crusade. He's going to meet Philip there, but he gets distracted. There are a couple things that he does along the way, right?
Yeah, I mean, he stops first in Sicily, where he wants to rescue or get back one of his sisters whose husband has been married to the king of Sicily. Her husband has died. He wants to get her and her dowry back. And along the way, he gets into some tussles with Greeks who feel that he's meddling in their own affairs. And so, yeah, it does take him quite a while to actually get to Acre, where he lands in Palestine.
Yeah. So he lands in Acre. Everyone gathers up, and he does have some successes there, but he doesn't actually achieve the objective, right?
No, he doesn't achieve the objective. Obviously, it's a difficult situation. Richard was, you know, now and at the time sort of known to be a very good military strategist, but you know, obviously the situation was really difficult. There was significant infighting among the European powers who each, you know, wanted to make sure that both that they reached their objective, but also that they got their share of the spoils of war when it was all over. And Richard seems to have just made a strategic decision that he probably wasn't going to be able to take Jerusalem. So he came to terms with Saladin and went home. And it was also important for him in that moment to go home because he felt rightly that Philip of France, who had gone home earlier, was conniving behind Richard's back with Richard's brother John, who wanted his throne. So it was a very sort of practical series of decisions that led Richard to abandon his crusade.
Yeah. I mean, you're not paranoid if they're actually out to get you, which John
That's right.
is.
Right.
Okay, so in the last 10 years, there's been sort of a spark debate about whether or not we should call Richard I a war criminal. And this is really based on one incident around Acre. So why would people be accusing Richard of being a spectacular war criminal in the context of the time?
Well, in short, Richard had a large number of Muslim prisoners of war executed. And it was felt, both now and at the time, that this was done against the rules and conventions of warfare. The argument in Richard's favor is maybe that he was, abroad, very far away from home, not a lot of supplies. He simply couldn't afford to feed and maintain a large group of prisoners. But then, of course, the argument against him is that he did have them all executed.
Yeah. And this is one of the things where it's not under debate. Like there are some things where like the Black Prince in the 14th century, did he kill a bunch of people? Did he not? But this, everybody agrees that there were a whole bunch of prisoners that were just summarily executed. So that part is not in debate. So then it becomes, how do we read this? Do we want to read Richard as a hero, or do we want to read him as a war criminal? What are we looking at here? So I think that's an important thing. Given that there's so much that's inconclusive about the Middle Ages, this seems to have been a conclusive incident.
That's right. And it also seems to be an incident that was shocking to people even at the time on both sides. So you do get Christian apologists for Richard's act, but even the fact that they're needing to apologize for it does show that people were genuinely, that this wasn't right. It was felt at the time that the conventions had been breached.
Yes. And there's going to be a lot of speculation in the things we talk about shortly about Richard's relationship with Saladin. Not his real name, but we'll call him Saladin because of this context. What is your impression of their relationship? Did they meet? Were they bros? What do you think happened?
I mean, I don't really know. I think what's interesting about the relationship between Richard and Saladin is that it seems to have provided a lot to the Western European imagination, in that you get a lot of representations of them as being equals, both very handsome, both very courteous, both very chivalrous, and this sort of imagination of them both out in Palestine fighting against each other, but at the same time really respecting each other's, moral and ethical aplomb. I don't know what that helps us to say about the actual historical relationship between these two men, but I think it does tell us a lot about the sort of crusading imaginary and the way in which, for Western Christians, they wanted both to capture Jerusalem, but they also wanted this to be a noble endeavor, and I think that's partly why the execution of the prisoners rung a real sour note, because they wanted not just to reclaim Jerusalem, but to do so in a very chivalrous, noble manner. So that's why it mattered that Saladin is represented as being this real figure of great chivalry and nobility on the Western model, so that he's a worthy adversary.
Absolutely. I think you're totally right about that. And this is the way that he's remembered in these Christian sources and romances later. It's just occurring to me for the first time as we're talking about this to really think about Richard and how he took the bad PR that he got from this decision that he made, because he is very sensitive to PR, which is, again, something we're going to talk about in a second. So I hadn't thought about that. Like we don't have any of his own apologies existing now that I know of. And that would have been really interesting to know how he dealt with that backlash that he gets from the Christians, people on his own side who maybe he imagined before this moment would support all of his decisions, and they don't. So he does make a truce with Saladin, and then he leaves the Holy Land. How do people feel about this truce? Were they into it?
It's hard to tell, right? I mean, certainly you have a lot of criticism that he failed in this goal. I mean, obviously it wasn't just him. As I said before, Philip of France had left the Holy Land earlier, and lots of other sort of European factions had left. So Richard, on the one hand, didn't achieve his objective, but on the other hand, when we look at his reputation, it's gone down in history, it's of a great crusader. He's the crusading king, and that's sort of what everyone agrees on is the core of his greatness as England's crusading king. So I think in that regard, in the longue durée, the fact that he didn't achieve his goal hasn't really mattered that much to his reputation.
Yeah, which is interesting in itself. Okay, so he makes a truce. He heads back because he has to head off John and Philip, who are conspiring behind his back. And then disaster. What happens on the way back from Crusade?
I mean, yeah, this is one of these crazy moments where truth is stranger than fiction. Richard's coming back. He gets shipwrecked in enemy territory. He is sort of caught between the lands of Philip of France and Leopold of Austria, both of whom have it out for him. So he has to try to sneak his way into safe territory. And he gets captured and he gets imprisoned. And there are loads of stories told about the manner of his capture. And one thing that historians have noted about them is that the German sources and the English sources tend to tell very different stories. So the English stories sort of have him manfully leap up with a sword when he's discovered, whereas the German sources have him in the most ignominious of positions. There's one that says, he was hiding in a peasant's hut, and as he was discovered, he was like turning the spit on the turkey, making dinner for his companions. So it's not exactly clear exactly what happened because all the chronicles tell slightly different stories based on their own investments. But in the event, he was captured. He was imprisoned first by the Duke of Austria, who then passed him off to the Holy Roman Emperor. He was kept in prison for over a year, and England had to pay an enormous, enormous ransom to get him back.
Yes, which they did with or without the help of Robin Hood. May come up later in our discussion.
Indeed.
So he gets ransomed. He makes it back to England, where he stays for the rest of his life, having learned his lesson, right?
Unfortunately not. No, he gets back, and as you can imagine, in his absence, everyone has been conspiring against him. His mother has been doing the very best she can do to hold things together in his absence. But he basically spends the rest of his life campaigning on the continent, trying to police the borders of his French territories and regain ones that have been lost in his absence. And he ultimately dies in that attempt.
Yeah, and people don't really talk much about this time. It seems like in the long biography of his life, it's not the most interesting part of it, him just fighting with Philip on the continent. But he does build a spectacular castle.
He builds some nice castles, yeah.
Yeah, so in the end, he does die in a way that is, again, like stranger than fiction. So how did he actually die? Because again, people tell lots of stories about this.
Yeah, that's right. There are lots of different stories. I mean, the most sort of romantic one is that someone had discovered treasure under the castle of Chalus-Charbon, and Richard wanted the treasure for himself. In reality, he was probably just trying to get back a strategically important castle, but the story goes that he went out sort of one evening to check on how the siege was going, and a lone archer from the battlements shot him. And Richard was not wearing armor because he was just on a reconnaissance sort of mission. And so the wound went gangrenous and ultimately killed him. In some ways, a very, ignominious death for such a crusading king. And there's this great quote from a contemporary chronicler who says, the lion was killed by an ant. So it definitely at the time was thought to be not the most heroic way to go.
Yeah, I think that in the book you've mentioned that William Marshall was like, it was poisoned because it feels like it had to be big, like it had to be a big event, and it really wasn't a big event. And I think that people wanted it to be a big enough event that you mentioned again in the book that when his heart was discovered where it had been buried, they actually did tests on it and the arrow wasn't poison. It was just garden variety gangrene, unfortunately. But that killed a lot of people.
But it's astonishing, right? I mean, these tests that were done on his heart were done in like 2016. So only a decade ago, people are still trying to figure out, how Richard the Lionheart died. It's got that sort of hold on our cultural imagination. But yeah, it turns out it was just gangrene.
Yes, well, he was human after all. Okay, so I have pinned you down to all these historical details, but it's really literature that is your jam. So we're going to turn towards literature now. First of all, you mentioned Roger of Howden. This is one of the people who was basically with Richard, beside Richard, like writing stuff down in his little notebook. Not really, but almost next to Richard. So tell us a little bit about the way that Roger of Howden saw him and reported about him within Richard's own lifetime.
Well, I mean, one of the really interesting things about Richard in the medieval context is that people seem to have recognized, even in the moment, that there was something unusual, something about him that was historical, a historical event in its own way. But Richard also had a little bit of luck in that the second half of the 12th century, during his lifetime, was also a period of enormous literary growth and development in Western Europe. So it seems these two sort of strands are coming together. And you can see in the 12th century different historians trying to find a way to capture this like lightning in a bottle that they were seeing in Richard the Lionheart. So in these 12th century chroniclers, Roger of Howden was kind of just an administrator. He was a parish priest, but he traveled with Richard, so he was able to see him in action firsthand. And he was also someone who was sort of part of this new generation of administrators who we would now recognize as being very interested in bureaucracy, very interested in like documents and having everything copied twice and filed in the appropriate place. So that Roger will often just copy charters and documents into his history. And he even copies a couple of letters that Richard himself wrote. So we get sort of a snapshot of Richard's own voice. So it's a sort of interesting eyewitness approach to trying to capture Richard's essence. Yeah.
Well, one of the ones that you pulled out, one of the quotes from one of Richard's letters that Roger had copied is something like, "We just took a bridge and the French king fell down. I think he said he had to drink from the river," which is just a wonderful quote. And exactly what you picture Richard the Lionheart would write in a letter back home, right?
Yeah, like, not a modest man, right?
Not at all. Which brings me to the question, like Roger is coming from the church, so not just a bureaucratic background, but a church background. And he is a bit critical about Richard's lifestyle, right?
Yeah, I mean, almost everyone who's writing history in the 12th century has some sort of clerical background. And also 12th century history writing tends to borrow from ethical models to write the stories that they're writing. So classical models, biblical models, they just interpret the present in the terms of the past. And we see Roger doing that a little bit. He's definitely someone who is a little bit judgmental about Richard's lifestyle sometimes. But I do think that Roger is trying not to be. He's trying to simply describe what he sees before him.
Yeah, and it would be tough to do that, to walk that line, especially because it just seems that what comes out of this chronicle is that he does admire Richard and thinks he's doing a pretty good job. And so, like you're saying, it's hard to be too critical of him, especially if you're standing right next to the guy. You want to be tactful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Although we have several sort of versions of Roger's chronicle, and it carries on beyond Richard. It's about, the whole history. It's not just about Richard's reign, but he does seem to have put the final touches on it after Richard's death. So we could maybe think of him as having a little bit of freedom of expression in that regard.
Exactly. Well, one of the great sources that you have in here as well is from Richard of Devizes, who doesn't seem to have known Richard personally, if I have that right. But he's one of these people that, as you're talking about him in the book, reminds me of that quote that I think has been attributed to a bunch of people, which is, "If you don't have anything nice to say, you can sit by me." Because this guy, he is a gossip, and I love it. I love it. So what does this Richard of Devizes, have to say about the king?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is fascinating. Roger of Howden and Richard of Devizes are basically contemporaries, but they take a totally different approach to trying to account for Richard the Lionheart's reign. So whereas Roger was trying to write a bureaucratic chronicle of events, Richard is writing satire, and he's very snarky. He writes exclusively about Richard's reign. So his chronicle begins with Richard's coronation, and it ends with Richard's failure to take Jerusalem. So he's really interested in thinking about Richard, but also particularly Richard's absence, like what England without Richard, sort of, which is also another sort of thread that we see continue through the literature about Richard the Lionheart. But yeah, so the satirical take is obviously entertaining and it's meant to poke fun, but it's also quite moralizing in a way, and we think of maybe the sort of more religiously oriented texts as being more moralizing, but no, in fact, all texts can be very moralizing, and Richard of Devizes is very much keen to, I think, puncture Richard the Lionheart's bubble in a way and bring him back down to earth.
Yeah. And I love this because people have the impression that like monks only think about holy things, but really they're spilling the tea, which is amazing.
Yes, that's quite right. Yeah.
I think he said something like Richard kindly relieved people of the burden of their wealth or something. People who were overburdened by wealth. Richard took care of that for them. Okay. So those are two of the people who are writing like just strict chronicle type accounts, even if they're satire, even if they're snarky, they're prose. But Richard also has a real relationship with the Troubadours, which comes back around to his early time in Aquitaine, especially, I would think. Do you think that's about right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the troubadour poetry is sort of invented in the middle of the 12th century in the south of France. So exactly the place where Richard's sort of basing himself. And in fact, Richard had this sort of family history with troubadour poetry because the man who was famously the first troubadour was William's maternal great grandfather, William II or Guillaume II, who's the first troubadour. So Richard had this sort of tradition in his family. And he also seems to have provided, just as much inspiration for troubadour poetry as he did for historians. We think now of troubadour poetry as being primarily love poetry, which it absolutely was, but it can also be political poetry. And Richard appears in a great many troubadour poems as a sort of warrior, as someone engaged in these petty political disputes on the borders of the counties of the south of France. So it's a really interesting moment.
Yes, and this actually gets woven into his legend as being part of the way that he escapes from captivity or is discovered in captivity. What's going on here?
That's right. There's this famous story, which is actually much later. It originates in the 13th century, but no doubt because of Richard's association with troubadours and troubadour poetry. But there's this story about the minstrel Blondel who is looking for Richard to try to find out where Richard's imprisoned. And he goes around singing this song that he and Richard have composed together, and only the two of them know. And one day he hears Richard's voice singing it back to him. So that's how they know where Richard is held and captive. And so they're able to spring him from prison because of this knowledge gained by Blondel the minstrel. It's absolutely not a true story, but it's a great story. And it really went down in the history books. And you see it repeated throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries as this sort of hallmark of this romantic take on Richard's reign.
Yeah. And as you say, it's not a true story, but you wouldn't put it past him. He's had such an exciting reign that, this could happen. But Richard did actually write a couple, or we think that he wrote a couple of surviving troubadour songs. What are those like? To me, they read like serious guilt trips. What do you think?
They are. There are two poems associated with Richard, one of which he wrote when he was in prison, and it's sort of putatively addressed to his half-sister, Marie de Champagne. But it's really sort of this complaint to all his vassals who he feels are not gathering the money for his ransom quite quickly enough. Mm-hmm. But it's also a really interesting sort of poem in its own right. So the first line is, "No prisoner will speak his mind." And so it sort of begins by borrowing the tropes of love poetry where, the poet is a prisoner of love and his lover has abandoned him. But in Richard's case, you fairly quickly find out that actually, no, he's a literal political prisoner and it's his vassals who have abandoned him. So he's really kind of cleverly playing on the tropes of troubadour poetry and overturning them. And the last word of each of the stanzas is prison. So to sort of drive home the point. So it's an interesting poem in its own right. And it does survive in quite a lot of copies, probably due to, its association with Richard as much as to its poetic merit. But yeah, it's still a really interesting poem.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you mentioned in the book as well is that Richard sort of courts this troubadour culture in a way that is sort of propagandizing. And so he brings some of them with him on Crusade, and he's hoping that they're going to write about him. And this is really interesting because, in the last 100 years or so, people are always talking about the English royal family and their relationship to the press, right? So it's interesting to see. It's interesting to see the way that Richard is sort of courting the paparazzi here and the ways in which he's hoping that they will write about him, whether that's always successful or not. It's not always successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the court of both Richard and of his parents, Henry and Eleanor, have long been associated with this sort of efflorescence of vernacular literature, especially in the second half of the 12th century. And certainly in the 12th century, literary production worked a little bit differently than it does now. It's not this sort of case we have now where you have a story, you want to write it down and you write it down and then you try to sell it. But it was more often literary production was based on patronage. So someone saying, oh, write this for me. And so we see very clearly these royal courts were very interested in literature. They're very interested in being seen as cultured in that regard. And for Richard, I think literature also was a form of soft power for his own prestige, but also to sort of make points and intervene in political disputes and political moments in interesting ways. So, I mean, much the same as it sort of works now.
Yeah. Well, and as somebody who's interested in literature, I wonder what his take would be on one of the things that features in a chapter in your book, which is a 14th century poem, which I actually talked about on the podcast years ago, called Richard Coeur de Lion. And it is hilarious. I think it's hilarious. I don't know what Richard would have thought, but this is a wild story. So tell us some of the things that happen in the 14th century reinterpretation, reimagining of Richard's life.
Yeah, this is a wonderful one. So Richard Coeur de Lion is sort of this modern title for really a collection of 14th and 15th century English romances about Richard the Lionheart. And they're really about Richard's crusade. But they add all these fantastical elements that, are not part of the historical record. So, for example, instead of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the romance has this exotic Eastern princess whose name is Cassiodorian, who is wonderful in every way except that she refuses to remain in church while the Eucharist is being elevated. And so finally, Henry's barons decide that this is a little weird and they force her to stay in the church during the elevation of the host. And in response, she grabs her daughter and her son and she flies out through the roof of the church and she drops her son. So John stays, but she flies away with the daughter and neither of them are ever seen again. So, and it's these sort of little romance touches like this that make the story so compelling, I think. But the real sort of incident that the romance describes that have put it on scholars' radar for the past 20 years or so is that it imagines this series of episodes where Richard is on crusade and he falls ill and he is nostalgic for home. And so he asks for a meal of pork, which of course is a quite loaded term in the context of crusade because of course Muslims don't eat pork. And in any case, they're probably on a lot of pig farming in the desert. And so Richard's cook can't find him a pig. And so he instead serves him the body of his dead Saracen enemies. And Richard eats this human flesh and feels much better instantly. And then when he asks to see the head of the pig he has eaten and the poor cook has to show him instead the head of a dead Saracen, Richard thinks it's great. He laughs and he's like, oh, this is perfect. We'll never starve now. We can always just eat up our enemies. So it's a crazy story. It's obviously designed to be sort of over the top and entertaining, but it also in a lot of ways sort of emphasizes the logic of imperialism and colonization. Like you don't just eat up territory, but you also eat up, metaphorically at least, your enemies. So I think it's had a long life in that regard.
Yeah, it is a wild story because even before he gets on crusade, he's making eye contact with the king who's imprisoned him while eating a lion's heart, just eating it raw. I think he squeezes all the blood out first and then he eats it. And then he extends this to his enemies, as you say, like the Saracens in quotation marks. This is what it's called in the romance, but obviously it would have been Richard's Muslim enemy that they're referring to. So, yeah, it's a horrible story. He just delights in this cannibalism for pages and pages and pages. It's crazy. But as you say, it was meant to be an entertaining story and not a historical story. But you got to wonder, how many people were reading this and were like, what?
It seems the whole romance seems to have been a fairly popular one. So we can't really know. And certainly the romance appears in different versions and the cannibal stories aren't in all the versions. So perhaps there were audiences at the time who were like, no, this isn't, I prefer something a bit more historical. But I think it's an interesting story in that it sort of shows the obvious directions in which Richard's sort of larger than life character could take story rather than history. And it's like a sort of interesting twist of history that we know that in the 19th century, Sir Walter Scott had a copy of that romance on his desk as he was thinking about his early medievalist novels, like Ivanhoe, The Talisman, the Waverley novels, and he pulls little bits from the Richard Coeur romance and pops them in lots of his novels. So it had a sort of longer influence than one might otherwise think.
Yeah, a long afterlife. Well, this is exactly where I was going because, we're getting to the end of our time, so it's time to rush to the 19th century. And at this point, not everyone is thinking of Richard as being as heroic as people thought in the Middle Ages. Some people are being very critical of him, and other people are reclaiming him as like the prototypical English, big capital E, big quotation marks, king, which is really interesting because, again, this is not what Richard would have thought of himself in his own time. So tell us what's happening in the 19th century here.
Well, yeah, as you say, in the 19th century, two things are happening. One, for the historians, there is a real reevaluation of Richard's character. And in part, this comes along because crusading sort of falls out of favor. And so there's a more sort of negative aspect attached to crusading culture. And on the other hand, with the growth of nationalism, scholars increasingly come to think, well, Richard didn't spend a lot of time in England. Richard just took all of England's money and left, right? Richard thought of himself as French. He spent all his time in France. So these two sort of, I think, attitudes combine to make historians really reevaluate Richard's character for the worse. But at the same time, you have the growth of medievalism in the 19th century, just this broader cultural, literary, artistic interest in the medieval past, which is showing up both in sort of architecture. Famously, the Houses of Parliament are rebuilt during the 19th century to look as if they are medieval buildings, but also throughout the literature, and Sir Walter Scott is the prime example of this. Novels set in the Middle Ages that really look back with this nostalgic longing to a lost time. And I think it's this double aspect of Richard's character in the 19th century that actually makes him a really fruitful site for literature because, if someone's all good or all bad, they're no fun, but Richard has these tensions pulling in different directions, and that makes him a sort of interesting site for authors to think with.
Yes. One of the things that you pulled out was Robert Baden-Powell saying, like, Richard is the original Boy Scout.
The original Boy Scout, yes.
Wild.
The sense of this, like, crusading and particularly chivalry becoming not just characteristics of the past, but also how we should think of ourselves in the present and the future. And, we still talk about chivalry, like what a gentleman should be, how a man should behave in regards to his duty to his country, in regards to women and children. So these are really, long-standing cultural benchmarks that get attached to Richard and that he comes to represent.
Yeah, and the quote that I had talked about at the very beginning of this that you say in your book is that Richard is appearing sort of on the cusp of all sorts of innovation. So he becomes sort of a central figure again, like a lightning rod here for innovation and continuity. So what do you mean by that in terms of literature and film and all that stuff?
Well, it's kind of fascinating to me how, as I said before, Richard's lifetime was also this moment of a real sort of cultural revolution in literature in Western Europe. But that sort of continues. So you see him appear in the very first novels with Sir Walter Scott. You find Richard in the very first movies as he becomes attached to the Robin Hood legend. You find him popping up in the Assassin's Creed video game. That there seems to be something about this figure that just has this longevity, but also a continued interest or continued flexibility that he can fit into different frameworks and can still produce interesting cultural work in different time periods. And I don't know that I have the answer to why that is, but I do find it fascinating and just wondering, where he's going to pop up next, what his future will be.
Yes, and it's such a good question, especially in terms of one of the things that you pull out as we're talking about the Robin Hood tradition. We're not going to talk about it much because we are talking about Robin Hood very soon on this podcast, but it's the long shadow of Richard in that he doesn't even appear. He doesn't have to appear, but he's still so resonant in his absence that people are using him as a character to lend whatever they need to their story.
And it's clearly his association with the Robin Hood legend that keeps him relevant in popular culture, that I think certainly into the 20th century, Robin Hood has remained relevant for so many ways that you'll no doubt talk about next time. But once Richard gets attached to that legend, I think the two of those figures sort of feed upon each other in interesting ways. So they almost become sort of ciphers for one another in interesting ways. So certainly the combination of the two is what has kept each of them, I think, relevant.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny how rarely are both of them in the ascendant. Like one of them is the original Boy Scout, or is it the other one? Or is it the other one? And so it's interesting to see how those play together, which is one of the reasons it's so wonderful to talk to you this week, because I'm talking about Robin Hood next week, and I'm hoping that people will look at your book and think more about how Richard appears, especially in the context of Robin Hood, but even more than that. So thank you so much, Heather, for coming on the podcast and telling us all about Richard the Lionheart.
And thank you for having me.
To find out more about Heather's work, you can visit her faculty page at UC Santa Barbara. Her new book is Richard the Lionheart in Life and Legend. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey, so we have some more research about the Black Death. It's that pandemic that keeps on giving to us medievalists.
Sure. Giving is not exactly the word I would use, but okay.
So this one charts out like a series of unfortunate events on to why it hit Europe in the mid-14th century, starting with a major volcanic eruption.
Where was the volcano?
So the researchers have no idea. They think it happened in 1345, but tree ring evidence and soil evidence kind of says, hey, there was really bad sulfur in the air around 1345 to 1349, which caused grain shortages. And then Italian city-states in their wisdom said, let's import grain from the Black Sea.
Right. Because the real story is how things got to Europe, and it really is a story about grain. So I guess this might tell us more. We can read all about it on medievalist.net.
Indeed. So yeah, it's a good piece of research. I thought it was a well-done article. It lays it out fairly good, except we have no idea where this huge volcanic eruption would have taken place.
So there is more research to be done.
Indeed. So we have that. Plus, although this news is already dropped by the time this podcast comes out, there is a big auction at Sotheby's going on, including medieval manuscripts, one of which is a 10th century gospel authored by women.
Amazing. So it is from a convent?
Indeed, from Germany, and it's expected to get around $1 million US. So those nuns will be doing well.
I think that they're dead, Peter. I don't think that they are getting any of the proceeds from this, but good for them anyway.
They can appreciate the fact.
All right.
So we have that, plus our top 10 open access articles for November, and also a piece from Loris Chevalier on how to insult like a medieval monk.
Ooh, I was just talking with my kids the other day about how to insult like Shakespeare. So I imagine that these monks were also, having studied monks, I got to tell you, I imagine some of these were pretty pithy.
Yeah, indeed. They're not nice to each other.
Well, not every monk every day is going to be nice to each other. It is a hard life that you're living with all these other dudes. I can imagine it got a little bit rough sometimes.
So we have that, plus a whole bunch more on medievalist.net.
All right. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us all about it.
Thanks.
As I've mentioned in the last few episodes, in 2026, I'll be taking over the patreon.com/medievalists account and turning it into a medieval podcast community. And I'd like to know what you think should be featured there. So I've set up a survey open to all patrons, and so far, the responses have been really helpful, not to mention really kind. If you're not currently a patron but you'd like to fill out the survey, go ahead and join the free tier at patreon.com/medievalists so you can let me know what you think. I'll be closing the survey at the end of the weekend, so please get your responses in as soon as possible if you have ideas for the new direction the Patreon should take. I've got to tell you, modern entrepreneurship isn't always easy, and sometimes you hit obstacles that would be really hard to explain to a medieval person. You can imagine my disappointment when I learned last Thursday that the helpful robots of the internet had made just about all my Amazon links for the holiday book list useless outside of Canada in their efforts to make my life easier. But with the tireless assistance of the valiant Virginia, things should be working now for all of you Canadian, American, and British listeners. To find out, and to find all the books featured on the podcast back to episode 250, including Heather Blurton's Richard the Lionheart, please visit the new and improved medievalpodcast.com/holiday book list. If the Amazon affiliate links are being friendly, feel free to use them to help fund this podcast. or you can just scroll the titles as a soothing replacement for holiday doom scrolling. Either way, I hope the list is useful to you. Thanks for all your patience as I make my way through the labyrinth of entrepreneurship, and for all the ways you've been supporting the podcast through Patreon, affiliate links, letting the ads play, and your kind words. For everything from Lionhearts to the performing arts, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.